Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation, looking at the slides. And I'm very pleased to share this very short presentation and very short talk to you. I'm also very sorry that I won't be able to take part in person in the virtual event, but it's the Easter break, the children are on holidays, and it's a week off after a very long term. So I apologize for that, because it has always been really one of my highlights of the year to engage with interested PhD students and talk about methods, which is one of my areas of expertise, and also one thing I find extremely important, particularly for the pluralist economists. Just a very quick background to myself. So I'm Annina Kaltenbrunner. I'm an associate professor in the economics division at Leeds. I'm a colleague of Andrew Merman, who is organizing this workshop. And I am what I would call a development macroeconomist. So I do work on developing in emerging economies. And I do particularly do mixed method research and qualitative research. So really, whilst what I will be talking about in this presentation comes out of my PhD research and is a paper published in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, but mixed method research is something which I continue to do, and I continue to do so with different colleagues. So it is something which is very close to my heart. So what I want to do in this very short presentation, I want to give you a very quick general rationale for the use of mixed methods research. Why or what's the purpose in general, what has been discussed in the literature, and then particularly what has been the rationale for using mixed method, or the justification, if you want. So what has been the justification for using mixed method research in heterodox economics? And I'm going to particularly talk about two. So I'm going to talk about critical realism and the Babylonian method by Sheila Dow. And then I finally want to give you at the end a very brief example of how I have used mixed method research within the context of heterodox economics, and seeking for an ontological justification or basis upon which to base my mixed method research. And as I said, that's a paper published in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, so you can access that. Just very briefly, as a way of introduction, I don't know how much you've seen in other presentations already, or what you have seen in the course, but if we want to look at the methods debate, there are basically two big camps. So on the one hand, we have a camp which we would call, or could call, methodological purists. So for these authors, each method is tightly linked to an ontological paradigm. So whereas broadly speaking, quantitative methods relate to positivist paradigms. So we're interested in measuring, quantifying, objectifying, watching. Qualitative methods have been more assigned to constructivist approaches, where we're interested in building up reality from the perceptions and actions of individual, to the extreme that they would argue a reality outside the individual doesn't exist. So in a purist perspective, we would have these different methods which very clearly represent different ontological paradigms with regards to ontology. So how is reality perceived? Epistemology, what can we know about this reality? Axiology, can we is observations, or is a reality value free? Can it be analyzed outside the individual? Can we make kind of generalizations or causal linkages? And the distinction between deductive and inductive logic, so where we have positivist approaches which are more deductive, they're deducing hypotheses and then testing them, where constructivist approaches are more related to an inductive logic, in the sense of observing phenomena and then working our way back up to building economic theories. So in this kind of purist camp, we have a notion that qualitative methods are very closely or kind of tightly linked to the constructivist approach. Quantitative methods are linked to the positive approach, and we cannot mix them. So mixing those methods would be inconsistent with our ontologies, and because methods reflect these ontologies, mixing them would be ontologically inconsistent. So in this methodological purist camp, if you want, so mixed method research would be impossible, because we are adopting an inconsistent ontological stance. So that is the one argument. The other argument, on the other hand, are what we would call methodological pragmatists. So in this view, the view is that mixed method research by all means is possible, and actually methods are not necessarily linked to specific ontological paradigms, but methods are just instruments, and we can use those instruments according to our specific problem at hand, according to the specific research question which we're asking, and the problem which we want to be uncovering. So for these approaches, or for these authors, mixed method research would be absolutely possible, and to the contrary would be an enrichment depending on the different research question and the research problem at hand. Now, there are very different ways of classifying the reasons for doing mixed method research, and the different justifications, and you will see later on I will talk about specifically which justifications we have in heterodox research, but very broadly based on Green et al. We can classify 5 potential purposes or reason of doing mixed methods. The first one is what we call triangulation. So we're using different methods in order to converge, corroborate, correspond, or have different insights into the same phenomenon. So here we're looking really specifically at the same phenomenon. Whereas in the case of complementarity, we'll be looking at the general research question, but we would be using different methods, so for example econometric, statistical methods, and focus groups, in order to look at different aspects or overlapping problems of a similar but not the same research phenomenon. Then we could use different methods for development. So we could use one method in order to generate ideas and generate research questions. And you will see that this is something which I do a lot, or which I have done and continue doing with mixed method research. We could, in a similar way, use them to initiate, so in order to discover paradoxes or contradictions or inconsistencies, and in a way improving and enriching our results by trying to tackle these inconsistencies and paradoxes with using different methods. And then finally, probably the broadest and all-encompassing reasons to do mixed method research would be expansion. So we're using different methods in order to expand on a phenomenon to enrich the phenomenon. So these are 5 different reasons pragmatists have argued we can use different methods, and not only use them, but also use them constructively and productively in order to create a more enriched and deeper insight into different phenomena. And so on and so forth. So you see there are many, many reasons of why we could be using mixed method research, and why they could be enriching our research question and our research problem. Now, in heterodox economics itself, as I said in the beginning, there are 2 main approaches, or 2 main paradigms, if you want so, which have been put forward or used in order to justify mixed method research. Now, before I go into them, I do want to say that whilst heterodox economics might in principle be more open to mixed method research, and the mere fact that we have got this workshop shows that it is still by far not an accepted thing. So we still have, even within heterodox economics, quite a strong, I would say, methodological bias towards statistical and mathematical theoretical modeling, and qualitative methods are by no means an accepted approach. So whilst we do have the space and the tools to do so, I would say it's still not a very widespread practice, and there's still a lot of room to grow and promote mixed method research. But going back to our kind of, if you want, so paradigms or ontological epistemological basis which we can use in order to conduct mixed method research in heterodox economics. The first and probably most widespread one is critical realism. And it's also the one I've used and I found very useful, and a lot of my PhD students have turned to if and when they did mixed method research. So in a nutshell, I assume you've heard a bit more about critical realism already in this workshop. Critical realism argues that reality is structured, so it includes, but it's irreducible to actualities such as events and states of affairs. It's open, which means event regularities are not ubiquitous, they're not always existent all the time. And they're differentiated, so closure sustaining event regularities do occur under some, but only under very specific situations. And this reality then, we can divide it into 3 different domains, 3 different levels. So we have the empirical, which is what we observe, which is what we can see. This is what traditional economists like to measure. Then we've got the actual, so these are the events which are causing them. So what's happening in order to produce this output? So if we think about inflation, so we're observing inflation, we're observing rising prices. What are the events that are causing it? Well, it could be a company setting higher prices. But then we also have the real. So what are the structures and mechanisms underlying these events which cause the empirical observable phenomena? And these then arguably depend a bit on where you stand theoretically. So from a Marxist point of view, and going back to our example of inflation, it would be class conflict. It would be the conflict between capitalists and workers and the conflict over wages. But these are underlying structures which are not necessarily observable, but which we need to uncover with our research. So in this ontological paradigm of critical realism then, mixed method research is necessary. I wouldn't say it's not just justifiable, but it's necessary in order to analyze and uncover these different features and layers of the same structured reality. And Andrew has done amazing work on that, and I think really pioneering work in providing this ontological basis for mixed method research based on critical realisms. So what he argues then, and I'll go into details in a minute, but what he argues together with Downward, is that the aim is by using different methods, we can construct a nexus of mutually supportive claims of reality without the presumption of being exhaustive, in which the whole stands distinct from its part. Andrew told me at some point he doesn't like that quote anymore, but I do like it a lot. So in practice, that can mean very different things. I've given you an example of how we could use different methods to reveal these different layers of a structured reality. But for example, we could use analytical statistics and in econometrics to test empirical surface phenomena. So are there causal relationships? Are there relationships under empirical? Whilst we could use qualitative methods like interviews or focus groups or participant observation in order to kind of uncover the underlying structures which are causing them, or potentially even the events. So in a way, what mixed method research, in a way, what critical realism does, it provides us, and I think that's why I find it quite attractive, it provides us an ontological basis for a pragmatist approach to mixed method research. So what critical realism does, it says not only can we do mixed methods because they're useful and because they enrich a phenomenon, and I think these are valid reasons by themselves, but it says that actually we've got an ontological reason to do so, and that ontological reason is our perception of reality as a structured, as an open, and as a differentiated phenomenon. Now, very briefly, I'm not going so much into detail here, but I think it's also a very valuable approach. The second heterodox writings which have been put forward in order to create the case or the need for mixed method research is the Babylonian method by Sheila Dow. And I call this the epistemological case for mixed method research, because rather than highlighting the nature of reality, as critical realism does, Sheila Dow seems to be more emphasizing our lack of knowledge, so our epistemological constraints in order to acquire knowledge about this structured reality. And so she writes that for this reason, explicitly partial analysis is necessary to deal with that incompleteness. We need separate fields, theories, and indeed methods to analyze the different facets of reality. So for anybody interested in methods and methodological thinking, I would really encourage you to go back to Sheila's work, which has been, I think, is very important and might have been potentially a bit overlooked in mixed method research. Right, then let's have a very quick look. I'm running out of time again, but constrained a bit less so if you talking on a presentation than if you have a fellow lecturer knocking on the door. But let's briefly talk about, I'll give you an example of what I've done. So, as I said, this example comes out of my PhD research where I had a lot of time on my hand, but I'm still continuing to do so. So I'm working on different projects at the moment about exchange rate determination in Africa, firm behavior in Brazil, etc. But this one is about exchange rate determination in Brazil or in the emerging market context more generally. And so what I did is my mixed method study was to conduct 52 semi-structured interviews, which I now find mind-boggling. I don't even manage to get 15 at the moment. But I did 52 semi-structured interviews. I sampled with foreign exchange traders. And I was particularly interested, because I was interested in exchange rate determination, I specifically target those which take directional positions, so which actually take a view on the exchange rate. I sampled them purposefully, so I chose my interview partners, and I used a lot of snowballing, which means I used contacts in existing interviews, and I asked open questions. So I used semi-structured in the sense that I used semi-structured and open in the sense that I followed the expertise of my interview partners, and open questions in the sense that they could tell me about their experience rather than narrow yes or no answers. And I triangulated those, so I mixed those with multivariate gauge models, where I really tested the exchange rate drivers, but I'll come back to that. Now, my theoretical basis was post-Keynesian exchange rate theory, which argues that, in line with post-Keynesian monetary theory, which argues that really what drives exchange rates are not underlying permanent fundamentals which have causal relations, but it is context and time-specific expectations in foreign exchange markets. So uncovering and finding out what these expectations are must be a key element of post-Keynesian inquiry to the exchange rate. And in addition to that, and you can see how this kind of also chimes well with the critical realism ontology, which I've just discussed before. In addition to that, I argued that it's not only these expectations, but it's the underlying structures which shape agent behavior in the form of the so-called currency hierarchy. So I argue in my work that the international monetary system is hierarchic and structured, and depending on where currencies and the agents which trade with them sit and are situated, the expectations will be formed differently and might differ. And I've used that then to complement that with critical realist ontology to create that case for mixed method research in order to uncover the different layers of reality. And more specifically, I argued that I needed to do, or the interviews were necessary in order to uncover these context and time-specific expectations of agents in the foreign exchange market as key drivers of the exchange rate, but also to uncover the underlying structures and find out what are the constraining features which influence agent behavior. And that then I triangulated, as I said, with econometrics, and that econometrics, in my view, was necessary in order to see how and to what extent these expectations and the operations and actions of individuals were actually translated into empirical surface phenomena. So how much exchange rate were really determined by the things which individuals thought were the main drivers of exchange rate. So it was about this empirical translation, but it was also about the magnitude of that translation, the statistical significance of that translation, and also the duration of that translation. So there's I don't have time to go into this, but even critical realism appreciates or acknowledges that there might be so-called temporary closures on the empirical level, so that we can observe things over time. But these are just temporary, or empirically observe them over time. But they're just temporary, and we can't assume them to be permanent. But these observations or these empirical regularities could break down at any time. So again, without going into too much detail, from a post-Keynesian perspective, for example, these regularities could be caused by conventions where people act as they have acted in the past and maintain these conventions. But of course, they can break down anytime. Yeah. And so what I found was that, I don't have this on my slide, but what I found is that expectations are indeed formed under uncertainty, that do indeed differ for emerging and developing economies because of that currency hierarchy. And I found that things like short-term interest rates and international market conditions are key determinants of exchange rates in emerging capitalist economies, which is not a surprising result for anybody working on exchange rates. But I think my point was really more to kind of create a holistic ontological and a mixed method inquiry to show that we can do that from this point of view. Now, just to finish up, of course, in addition to these ontological justifications, for me, there are also many practical reasons why we want to do mixed method research, in a way that goes a bit back to the 5 purposes which I've given you at the beginning about mixed method research. We might just want to do them because It gives us new ideas. We might do them because we can't get the data otherwise. We might do them because we just want to understand what's going on. So very often, if you approach a new research question, it's really important to talk to people who are experts in this field to know what's going on. So there are many reasons why interviews or qualitative research can be very enriching, even if one doesn't do that large scale study as I've just described before. But of course, there are also many problems doing with mixed method research. So even doing it, it is, first of all, we are still kind of framed by the research questions we ask, and it is true that different methods are allowed answering different research questions, which means they can give us a richer insight, but also means that sometimes they're not quite immediately compatible. And so actually bringing them together in a kind of holistic narrative is not always that easy and always that straightforward, and does require some additional thinking and justification maybe sometimes to make them speak to each other. The other thing is that particularly qualitative methods and in a way doing both requires an immense amount of expertise and skill and time, which one might not have anymore in that specialized field of economics. So, for example, my econometric skills are by no way good enough anymore in order to actually publish in high-ranked journals. So in this case, mixed method research might really become increasingly the outcome of a team rather than an individual researcher further down the line. And finally, there is, I think, as I've said before, there is still a disciplinary bias. So even within heterodox economics, we economists still seem to have a bias for quantification, causality, proving relations, rather than a kind of, maybe more fuzzy, more complicated, more nuanced insights which interviews might give us, enriching, but maybe not always that straightforward or convincing for economists in that way. But nevertheless, everybody goes their path. But for me, mixed method research is still the way to go, and I think that it provides such a rich and powerful picture of empirical phenomena that cannot be provided by using methods on their own. Right, thank you very much for listening. I've gone a bit over time, but I still hope you found it interesting nevertheless. And of course, I'm open for any questions you might have. Thank you.